Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the enormous privilege of serving as the president of Hunter College, where the American dream still comes true online and on campus. Our campus is again open. Fully vaccinated students and professors are bringing new energy to Hunter College. One of the challenges of reopening that there's so much happening now at so many places that I could not be with you in person this evening. But I've seen the Pauli Murray film and wanted very much to celebrate it tonight by greeting you this evening on tape. Before beginning this evening's special Welcome Back program, I want to take a moment to recognize the perseverance and dedication of the Hunter faculty, students, and staff who during the pandemic have built on our tradition of excellence. And now that guests are at last returning to Roosevelt House, a very special thank you as well to the incredible team of Hunter administrators who have worked tirelessly to ensure a safe return to campus, and to Harold Holzer, our Jonathan Fanton director, and the whole Roosevelt House team who have made this return engagement tonight possible. What better way to launch a brand new season of in-person Roosevelt House events than with a celebration of the life and work of a legendary Hunter alumna from the class of 1933, the incomparable Pauli Murray. A non-binary Black writer, activist, priest, and visionary legal pioneer, her work transformed both our culture and our laws, helping to create vital legal protections for race and gender equity. And it started here in what has been called the city of her dreams, in a college that welcomed, nurtured, and celebrated her talents. In addition to her later achievements as a lawyer and writer, Pauli earned influence over and friendships with some of the most prominent and powerful leaders of her time. Chief among them, the First Lady of our country and this house, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor famously dubbed Pauli a firebrand for her passionate and uncompromising positions on racial injustice. Pauli could be tough, even with Eleanor. But Mrs. Roosevelt saw something in the young activist and went on to encourage her and mentor her. To begin a lifelong bond built on deep and mutual respect and initiated by an emphatic letter of protest from Pauli to Eleanor, in which she held the Roosevelt administration to account for its inaction on racial violence. An intense and candid correspondence led Eleanor not only to appreciate Pauli's resounding message of justice and equality, but to use her position to amplify it. Whether through her relationships with the country's elite or her many endeavors across legal, social, and literary realms, Pauli always embodied the Hunter historic motto, Mihi Cura Futuri, the care of the future is mine. She also exemplified our unofficial motto, you can always tell a Hunter girl, but you can't tell her much. Yet despite Pauli's tireless work for the betterment of society and how often and avidly Hunter College has lifted up her name, her memory, and her accomplishments, Pauli has remained a figure widely neglected by history, that is, until now. Thanks to the release of this extraordinary documentary you have just seen, My Name is Pauli Murray, viewers around the world will at last be introduced to Pauli Murray, not just the unique person and personality, but the trailblazer and genius who changed our world and laid the groundwork for a more just and equitable future. For their work in reintroducing Pauli to the world, we could not be more grateful to our two special guests tonight. It is a great pleasure to welcome them to Roosevelt House, the co-directors of the film, Julie Cohn and Betsy West. Julie Cohn's previous works include the Oscar-nominated RBG, also co-directed with Betsy West, which examines the life and career of another icon of jurisprudence, the late, great Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Julie also directed the acclaimed documentaries American Veteran and The Sturgeon Queens. A longtime producer for NBC News, Julie has won many New York Emmy Awards. It's wonderful to have her at Roosevelt House. Her collaborator, Betsy West, also comes from a TV news background with more than 20 Emmy Awards for her work as a producer at NBC News on shows like Nightline and Primetime Live, and as Senior Vice President at CBS News, overseeing the iconic programs 60 Minutes and 48 Hours. Her previous films include RBG, Makers, and The Lavender Scare. Julie and Betsy, thank you so much for the vision and dedication that went into making this film and for helping to give a global voice to one of our most beloved and inspiring Hunter alumna. And congratulations on the news that your Pauli Murray film has just won the Audience Favorite Award at the 42nd Annual Aspen Film Fest. To speak with Julie and Betsy tonight, we are delighted to welcome Hunter College Acting Provost, Dr. Valida Dent. Valida is not only a superb administrator, but also a leading scholar on the effects of rural poverty, not unlike the conditions under which Pauli Murray was raised in the South. Co-founder of the Rural Village Libraries Research Network, Valida's research and writing on literacy has been widely published and presented at academic conferences around the world. We are so grateful that Valida joined us first as the Acting Vice President for Student Success online in September 2020 as the pandemic raged. She then added the title of Acting Provost in October 2020 and has done a simply extraordinary job in supporting our reopening this fall. She is a deeply talented administrator, a fact that we attribute to her Hunter College education. Valida is not only a star alum, she spent much of her early career as a leader on our library faculty. Valida, we are glad you have come home to Hunter, and thank you for being with us tonight. Again, thank you all for joining us in person and on Zoom tonight. As some of you know, I wrote an op-ed piece on Pauli Murray for the Daily News last week and devoted much of it to describing how Hunter College offered a free education to Pauline Murray, as she was then known, when she could not enter Columbia because it accepted no females, or attend Barnard because it was too expensive. At Hunter, Pauli would write, there was, quote, no admission bias on race, gender, or economic status. Not much has changed here. We work to keep hope and opportunity alive. At Hunter, Pauli found what she called a natural training ground for feminism, and as the film has shown, she went on to bring that Hunter-grown training to the wider world. She would work, often behind the scenes, to change the laws on equal rights, civil rights, and women's rights, and to profoundly influence Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Thurgood Marshall. Yet she has long been denied the recognition and fame she earned. Thanks to Julie Cohn and Betsy West, Pauli is at last basking in the spotlight she deserves. Thank you all, and now it's a pleasure to turn the discussion over to Provost Valida Dent.
Truly an honor, and these are on, so I can actually use the mic. And I think we'll get started. I just wanted to say thank you to President Rob, to Harold Holzer, and to all of the community members who are here with us tonight. So I have prepared some questions to lead us through a discussion with our creative artists here, and then I understand that we will have some time for Q&A, and we also have folks joining us, our online community, our virtual community, who will have some questions for us as well. So I'm actually going to stand, if that's
Good.
okay. So we were talking in the green room before we came in tonight, and I was explaining that I let my 8-year-old daughter watch just a portion of the film. I watched it a couple of nights ago, and I let my 8-year-old daughter join me for just a few minutes of it that I thought were completely appropriate for someone of her age. And she had lots of questions, but the one question that stood out was, so when am I going to learn about Pauli Murray in school? We haven't learned about her yet. And I did not have an answer for her. And so one of the first questions that I have has to do with why we collectively don't know more about Pauli Murray. My mother and Coretta Scott King are first cousins. And Coretta spent a great deal of time as I was growing up talking to me about the role of women in the civil rights movement. But a large segment of that conversation had to do with the fact that women were mostly invisible. And we know that from the film as well, that, you know, there was not only the erasure because of race, there was also the erasure because of gender. And so that's my first question. Why don't we collectively know more about Pauli? And is that going to change?
Well, thank you, everybody. It's so cool to be here at Roosevelt House. I mean, really, it's so neat. I wonder if Pauli ever came to visit Eleanor here. We know that Pauli was at Valkill. But anyway, it's really wonderful. And to be at Pauli's alma mater, thank you. I think you've partially answered the question, which is that obviously, you know, there was a lot of sexism in the civil rights movement in terms of who got credit for doing things. And also, you have to say there was racism in the women's movement in terms of understanding the problems of African American women and giving credit to someone like Pauli Murray. You know, but I think it's more nuanced than that also because, first of all, Pauli was someone so far ahead of the time that by the time everybody else caught up, Pauli was on to the next thing. That was certainly, you know, the case with in civil rights and in women's rights and you know, throughout life. And there was something restless about Pauli Murray, you know, always looking for the next challenge. And you know, you cannot discount the role of Pauli's very private struggle with gender identity at a time when there just was no language, there was no understanding. I mean, it must have been incredibly lonely and probably inhibiting for Pauli getting out there and taking credit for things. So you know, you have to wonder what role that played in, you know, having Pauli be more reticent to be front and center as a leader. But I think there is some good news about what's happening now, which has been going on since, you know, the historians have been looking at Pauli for the past decade or so, especially African American academics who've been writing about Pauli, studying Pauli. So it's not us really completely discovering this, but it's others, and that's beginning to filter into our school systems, I think. You knew something.
Yeah, I mean, you know, our anecdotal information tells us, just having worked on this project over 3 years and running into various people, the #1 predictor of whether someone was more likely to have heard of Pauli Murray was not, as we might have expected, race or sexual orientation or gender identity. It was age. The younger someone was, the more likely they were to have heard of Pauli Murray. A lot of college students are familiar with Pauli, and there is a movement now to add Pauli Murray to a number of curriculums, including the New York City. There's a curriculum being developed in the New York City public schools that includes Pauli Murray. So I think, you know, I think maybe 10 or 20 years from now, it might be a different conversation. Pauli was someone, as the head of Pauli Murray College says at the end there, whose time had not yet come, but it's like it's coming now. So hopefully that will be reflected in classrooms.
That's really good news. 10 years is too long, but you know, every journey has to start someplace. I think one of the other things that struck me about the film was that there was an overwhelming, or I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness at different points in time. Just an undefinable sense of sadness that was sometimes overwhelming. And I think a part of that, you touched on this, that Pauli really struggled to sort of find her space. And some of that was made manifest through her work and her accomplishments. But the other piece, the interpersonal piece, it was a lifelong struggle. And I felt incredibly sad about that. And the film, I think, through the way that the music and the artistic overlay, and I love the use of the collage, all of that really gave a very tangible sense, I felt, of sort of the mixed emotions that one might have when watching the film. But I had a question about the creative aspects. How did you all decide on sort of the feeling of the film? You know, the music, Pauli was narrating her own life. Her poetry was interwoven. You know, there were the artistic pieces. How did you all decide to go in that direction with the film?
Yeah, you know, the idea of Pauly telling Pauly's own story to the extent possible was something that was very much on our minds from the beginning. It was really only the discovery of not only, it wasn't so much the papers in the Pauli Murray archives, it was the 40+ hours of audio taped interviews and oral histories, and then later we discovered the audio taped version of most of Pauly's autobiography. It was like once we listened to that material that we realized, like, oh, you know, there could actually be a documentary about this person who, after all, had died at that point 35 years ago, now a bit more. In terms of the specifics of the creative aspects of putting it together, that's where the number of us here is a little bit too small, because the film's producer, Talea McMahon, and editor Cinque Northern, both based in LA now. You know, the decisions about how to weave the story together become sort of a larger group of us, and we appreciate your mentioning the art and composer also bringing their artistic visions and thoughts. And as you say, there was a lot of emotion in this story. Struggle, sadness, frustration, challenge, but also we felt like some inner strength, sort of a core of inner strength with Pauly, and some real moments of joy, which were evident in that great black and white videotape of Pauly, you know, from 1979. So we were trying to hit a wide spectrum of emotions, often kind of flipping back and forth relatively quickly.
Very, very well done. So there were a number of quotes that struck me. I think the one that was the most memorable for me personally was the quote that had to do with the Virginia bus protest, the boycott, her boycott. The intimacy, and this is I'm paraphrasing, right? Yeah. The intimacy of the bus interior permitted the public humiliation of blacks in the presence of whites. That is probably one of the most profound quotes that I have ever heard articulating the pain of racism, right? So racism is not a solitary, you know, she's saying it's not a solitary experience, that the entirety of this experience has to happen in the presence of those who have deemed you to be inferior. Yeah. And I just wonder how that, I mean, I'm sure that resonated and probably struck you all when you found that quote.
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of gobsmacked by that quote, frankly, because it was something I realized I'd never really thought about, the complicity of the passengers. Everybody's just going along with this, and as Pauly says, the privileged few were sitting there, and then our archivist found that photograph that we really lingered on because we thought that the quote was so powerful and just a different perspective. At least, you know, it was very moving to us.
Yeah. I you know, replayed that again and again in my mind, and of course, you know, that quote applies to many different sort of spaces that we all collectively inhabit, right? But that bus, the interior of the bus, was a metaphor. So just very, 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 very striking. So I wanted to ask you all a question. How did you find Dr. Brittany Cooper? I wanted to take her course.
I know. No, listen, believe me, I was in that classroom and just blown away by the class. It was so much fun. But Julie can tell you how we came across Brittany.
Yeah. So we actually went very early in the process of making this film. We went to an event at the Schomburg Center about Pauli Murray. The reason that we went there was because Patricia Bell-Scott, also in the film, who had already, I believe, come on as our consulting producer at that point and lives in Atlanta, said, "Oh, I'm coming to New York to go to this event, like you should come to it." We went. It was actually Patricia Bell-Scott and Brittany Cooper together, and the combination was really powerful. Like the different generations, the different style, like both such experts on Pauli Murray and both bringing their own individual unique energies to this story. And we were like, what? We were like, okay, let's book, you know.
So one of us, we were making a beeline to Brittany Cooper when in the audience a hand was raised and this woman stands up and she says, "My name is Margreta McBean and my mother was Mac McBean," the companion, Pauli's companion, going, and we're going, what? And she said, and my mother, I never knew if the stories that my mother was telling me before I was born, if they were true. Like, my mother told me about Pauli Murray and getting arrested on a bus, and part of me just thought, like, really? She spent time in, I didn't believe it, and she kind of told tales, and then I heard about this, I got the biography, and, because there've been a couple of biographies, so Julie made, I think, the beeline to Brittany Cooper to talk to her. I made the beeline to Margreta McBean because that was kind of an incredible moment, yeah.
She was just so dynamic, and you could feel the students just being drawn in that space and being completely engaged. And the other, I think, really interesting thing, you mentioned age as like a predictor of whether or not somebody is likely to have heard of Pauli Murray. I think there's a particular resonance now with college-age students, because a lot of them are living in spaces now where the story is just on repeat. Right, and so I love the fact that there's dynamic faculty out there teaching Pauli Murray, but really like teaching Pauli Murray. So I did have I was interested in learning about Pauli's early life. Did you all get a sense that those early traumas, or those early challenges somehow shaped her future development, and if so, how? How do you think that contributed to the Pauli that we saw in the film?
Yeah, well, certainly, the early trauma of, in effect, losing both parents, the mother to death and the father to mental illness, institutionalization, and actually, Pauli's father ultimately was killed in an institution by a guard, so a really story that's just like suffused with pain, and then being, taken away from your siblings and moving to another place. So there's the one side of the story that's just pure pain, but as so many things in Pauli's story, there's also a flip side of warmth and joy, which is the, unflinching and so steady love of Aunt Pauline, who ultimately legally adopted Pauli, and just throughout life just expressed this complete acceptance for everything that Pauli was, and and also being an educator is taking Pauli to classes, and that's, it was great to hear about your interest in library and literacy, because that's so much of Pauli's very early life love of learning and books, not only the chapters that we mention in the film, but also Pauli's grandfather was going blind and made Pauli read the newspaper every morning. Pauli also was one of those kids who likes to take every single book from the library and just read through it. And I think love from family and love of learning and books just gave Pauli a lot of deep, a steady core that lasted until death.
And I have to say, it's Aunt Pauline who's the one who brought Pauli to New York City, first of Columbia, where they said, sorry, we don't accept women, then across the street to Barnard, where they said, oh, you're an interesting candidate, but sorry, you can't afford to come here. And then Hunter, actually, Pauli had to go to high school for a year here in New York in order to enroll in Hunter, because Pauli couldn't have passed with the education that Pauli had in an impoverished high school in North Carolina, could not have passed the New York State Regents Board exam, so was boarding with a relative and, commuting a long way to go to high school, and actually was befriended by another girl who had a pretty stable family, was helping her and teaching her, and it's an incredible story. There Pauli was on her own, just determined to go to Hunter, to qualify and to get in here, and then once being accepted, feeling pretty, at least not spiritually or inferior, but feeling that these smart girls know more than I do, and really having to work hard to get grades up and to pass as well as Polly did.
I just wanted to do a time check. I want to make sure I leave enough room. Okay, all right. So I'm good with one or two more. So I'm interested in the poetry that was chosen. How did you choose which lines? And I'm sure that was a thing because there must be so many lines of poetry that you could use. So how did you choose what you chose?
Yeah, the poetry was something that actually expanded quite a bit in the process, because all of us working on the film were really found that like sticking a line of poetry in had a really strong impact, even when we didn't have Polly's voice reading it. Just having the experience of reading the words often felt like it hit us all in a very emotional way. And often the poetry we chose was a combination of poems we loved, but also poems that seemed like they stemmed from and flowed back into what else was happening in the story. There were definitely experiences I can recall in the edit room at one point, like where Betsy's on like Google, like just like scrolling through lots of Polly's poems, looking for a few lines that will fit in a particular moment. And some that it's been fun now that the film is out on Amazon Prime, where people start quoting certain lines. And one that we had chosen just because we needed a transition coming out of the section about the early feminism, which ends with the line, surrender to none the fire of your soul, which has been kind of a very much, picked up on and quoted by people. And it is an incredibly powerful line, but we were just, looking for a transition.
Oh, this will work.
I know. No, that I think that the poetry, along with the moments of silence, very powerful, because it sort of gave the audience a chance to just sort of sit and sort of trying to take in what we were experiencing on the screen. So let's take some questions from the audience.
I really enjoyed the film, and I just wanted to say something about Eleanor Roosevelt and Polly. As far as I know, Polly would not have come to this building, because in the 1930s, after Franklin was elected, Eleanor had her own apartment in New York, and that's where she would meet with people.
Right.
And then
Thank you.
in the 1940s, starting in 1945, she had an apartment on Washington Square West. And that's where Polly came to meet with her. And in fact, Eleanor does mention this in one of her newspaper columns. But there is another very significant relationship with African American women in this house, which was 1927, when Mary McLeod Bethune came here as an educator and became a friend of Eleanor and Sarah Delano Roosevelt, and that eventually led to her involvement with the New Deal as an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. So there is a connection for the previous generation, and also Eleanor's introduction to the civil rights battles of African Americans, which turned her into a very strong advocate.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I know. I have to wait for it. But I'm going to take my mask down for the microphone. Hi. I was curious. I see that I looked up before that Pauli Murray died in Pittsburgh. Where did she go to seminary, and where did she practice as an Episcopal priest? Because I love that footage at the end.
She went to seminary here in New York. Downtown, was it General? Yes, I believe that's correct. But then I think Polly left there and went to another, because they were pretty sexist, and it was tough. It was a tough life. This is after, becoming a professor and having a decent life, and then graduated from somewhere else. which I don't remember. Do you
in
remember?
Virginia, I think.
Virginia, but
And,
never had a
No,
parish.
Polly didn't have a parish, and that's where I mean, by this point, the issue was actually age discrimination as described by Polly. I mean, this is, you know, Polly's in her 60s at that point and couldn't find a home church, but actually did quite a lot of guest, you know, being a guest
a circuit, sort of a
clergy
circuit.
person, and we actually had the opportunity to meet a number of people who had heard Polly coming to their church frequently. So,
Hi, I wanted to ask, was she buried or cremated?
Polly was buried, and it's here in Brooklyn. I actually just recently went to the cemetery. Is buried with Renee's in the Barlow. I think Aunt Pauline, who at one point had moved to Brooklyn as well, is buried there. There's one big tombstone that includes Polly, Aunt Pauline, I think maybe Aunt Sally, Irene Barlow, and Irene Barlow's mother, all in, I don't want to say the name of the cemetery wrong, so I'm not going to say it, but it's in Brooklyn. It's huge. I think it's Greenwood, yes.
Did Polly get to meet Roosevelt in person and his wife?
FDR.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, for all of the talk
For-
about meeting with Eleanor,
I don't
I'm not
know
sure Polly
that
ever
Polly ever met
FDR.
him. She, you know, Polly was writing to him, but getting the responses from Eleanor, not from him. I'm guessing no, because as this woman has explained, they lived kind of separate lives, and I think that a lot of Eleanor's friendships and other associations were apart from him.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi. I learned about Polly Murray in college when they renamed the school at Yale after her. So thank you so much for bringing this story to light. My question is actually about some of the footage from her historical home in North Carolina and how much you worked with the center there, because I know that they carry on her legacy through education. Thank you.
Yes, we did work with the Polly Murray Center in Durham. That's obviously where we filmed that one scene, but we were connected with them relatively early in the process to let them know what we were doing. You know, most of the materials actually are at the Schlesinger Library, which is more connected with the Polly Murray Foundation, which in essence is Polly Murray's family and estate. So, but pretty much all Polly Murray, those who've been carrying on Polly's legacy for quite some time. And in Durham, interestingly, when we traveled to Durham to do that's another that's another segment of the population that knows Polly well. Everyone in Durham knows who Polly is, and Polly is really a household name throughout Durham. So it's interesting to see among both black and white Durhamites.
Hi, I'm just curious. Polly Murray was connected with so many different academic institutions.
Yes.
But I didn't hear that she was directly connected with Harvard, and I was curious how she made the decision to leave her papers to the
Yeah, I mean,
Schlesinger
Polly did
Library.
live in Cambridge, and in the late 60s and early 70s, and certainly was in a kind of intellectual world there. But there's been a suggestion, and the Schlesinger Library has the reputation of having the archive of some of the most well-known, notable American women. It's basically the Schlesinger Library and the library at Smith, and there's also there's another library involving more Union women in, I think, North Carolina. So, but we kind of think it was Polly thumbing a nose at Harvard and saying, "Look, you wouldn't let me in," and it was very deliberate that Polly picked Schlesinger, talked to them, made the arrangements, and then told Karen Rouse Ross, her grandniece, "This is where my papers are going." Yeah.
This was such a wonderful film and incredibly moving at this particular moment in time, and the relevancy that it crosses on so many different levels. I'm curious, What is your next project? I mean, you said this one has been on, you've been working on this for 3 years. You did RBG, where the crossover is amazing. And I don't know, did you find out about Pauly by doing the other documentary? So what's next in the line? I mean, you know, you're obviously drawn to powerful women who have made such indelible marks.
It's a big landscape. There are a lot of opportunities out there, Maureen.
I know there are,
a lot
Betsy,
of,
but
there are a
I'm
lot
curious.
of women's stories that haven't been told, and I think, yeah, we actually have done a film about Julia Child, which you know, someone better known than Pauly, but perhaps not recognized significantly for changing the world. And then we are working now on a film about another woman, a living woman, and hope to have that done by next year. But this person would rather, yeah, exactly. This person would rather we not announce that that's happening yet, but we've been filming that, which is a different, very different to be doing it's a much more verite film because we're following her around. But there are similarities to Pauly's story, including a very good love story and determination, persistence. So. The question, I'll ask the question. The question is, do we ever think about doing a narrative film instead of a documentary? And the answer is no.
Not really. However, that said, we very much hope that there will be a Pauly Murray narrative project, not by us, but there are, you know, certainly are a number of people considering that, and we really hope it happens. I mean, you know, the different formats like have an ability to spread a word much further, and as Betsy said earlier, there have been so many extraordinary both academic and popular writings about Pauly Murray for decades that are fantastic, but like having what a documentary, and with the sort of marketing force of Amazon Studios behind it, can all of a sudden increase knowledge of Pauly Murray way beyond people that actually see the film, frankly, because they, you know, might have noticed some of the promotional stuff. That would be magnified like tenfold by a narrative film, and I think if for no other reason, we'd love that to happen because of that.
I just had a curious question, if you know the answer. Did she attend here or the Bronx campus?
Manhattan. And actually, I don't know how many people are literally Hunterites here, but I think we should just say, you know, Pauly had a lot of, there were so many institutions that rejected Pauly, first of all. Then there were the institutions that Pauly went to, but about which Pauly had a number of complaints, including Yale Law School, where Pauly was frustrated to deal with racism, and had also the one institution that actually was the big exception to that is Hunter. Like it's really worth, if you're a Hunter lover, to get Song in a Weary Throat, Pauly's autobiography, and read the chapter about Hunter and talk and hear the way Pauly talks about the way that professors and classmates alike really contributed to intellectual development. And there's a great story about a professor who took the class to the Natural History Museum and everything. That Pauly just had so many deeply warm things to say about Hunter that I was thinking when President Rob was speaking about, like, in this case, like, wow, Pauly really identified strongly as a Hunter alum. So.
I have a question here that comes from one of our virtual attendees. My name is Mac, I work here. So this is from Pamela Schneider, who's with us on Zoom. She asks, since Pauly Murray was so formative in the advancement of civil rights and gender equality, why do you think that her story has not been included in the history books? Do you think it was because she was so ahead of her time and society was not ready for her?
Yes. I mean, we kind of answered that earlier, you know, and you know, throw in some racism and some sexism and some, you know, perhaps, you know, problems having to do with Pauly's gender identity. But I think, in a way, Pauly was always just so far ahead.
And this is just one more from an anonymous virtual attendee. the letters to doctors from Polly were fascinating. In addition to this film, is there emerging scholarship that does not shy away from her personal struggles with gender and identity, even though she was so private about it?
Yes, well, a book that came out maybe 4 years ago called Jane Crow by Rosalind Rosenberg really talked in quite in depth about Polly's gender identity issues throughout life, and is where we first learned about that, which we then sort of bolstered with more looking more in the archives. You know, those, like the author of that book, we struggled somewhat with the question of how much of this obviously very personal and not public during Polly's lifetime information to get into, but came to the conclusion that it seems pretty clear from the archive that the collection of material was carefully curated in such a way that it suggests that everything that's in there is in there because Polly actually wanted it to be seen in the future, and those letters are in the collection that Polly quite deliberately gave to this archive.
Hi, again. Eleanor Roosevelt was a big supporter of Brandeis University. Polly ends up there. And then they bring in Anita Hill later on, who of course introduced the concept of sexual harassment. I wonder if there's a through line there in terms of Brandeis's willingness to host African American women who are otherwise excluded.
Interesting. I mean, I think that at the time that Polly was hired, you know, there was a big push in academic institutions because there were hardly any African American professors anywhere. And I think that if you look at academia in the early 1970s, as African American students were just demonstrating and pushing for African American studies and just more inclusion, that a lot of institutions were hiring probably a token numbers of minority professors. So I don't know if there's a direct relationship between Polly Murray, frankly, and Anita Hill, because that to me it seems, and I think that's what Polly felt also, that this was something that they felt they needed to do, and Polly was one of the very few African American professors on campus, which is why those men that you see in the film gravitated to Polly, because they wanted to have a professor who was African American, and there were hardly any.
Well, to everyone here and on Zoom, thank you for being part of this event. Thank you, Julie and Betsy and Provost, for reopening Roosevelt House. Thank you.
Thank you.